Hello, and welcome to Varnblog's Radical Engagement series. And we continue reading Raymond Geuss's Not Thinking Like a Liberal, which came out, I believe, in 2022. Yeah, 2022. We are in Chapter 2, Liberalism, the section Sovereign of the Individual. I'm often skipping the parts of his biography that are in here. I think they're actually quite interesting and do inform the philosophical arguments being made. But I don't just want to read the whole book to you because that would be a violation of fair use and I would, get in trouble. There's ebooks for a reason and I don't have the license for that. But two, and I think you should read the book. But two, the personal experience here is useful for context, but not necessarily super useful for parsing the philosophical and political arguments here. So we skip ahead to page 33 in my edition of the book, which is the Belknap Harvard hardcover. And we are on the section Sovereignty of the Individual. And this is Geuss. Still, what did this have to do with liberalism? The instruction in my school took direct aim at the conception of the sovereign, self-transparent individual, which was central to all forms of liberalism. First of all, Kliegler said, humanly speaking, no individual, not even the most self-sufficient, was truly independent and free-standing. Each person was multiply dependent on other human beings, in the first instance their own families and then on society. Metaphysically, and Krieger was his priest and teacher, no human was independent of God. It was also simply not true that most people knew themselves and their inner world better than they knew the basic features of the external reality, or they didn't knew themselves better than others knew them. I don't know what I think or believe, and I don't know for certain what I want. As a side note, I actually believe this too. When people are like, I know myself. Do you? Do you really? Do you not think the people who love you and care for you know you? Yes, they may have abused you. Often they've abused you. That doesn't mean they don't know you. Often your enemies even know you better than your friends. And, enemies is such a melodramatic phrase. The people who are close to you that wish you ill, or at least have maintained an casual indifference to you, often do know you. The sovereign individual often does not know himself or herself or themselves, because the sovereign individual does not know the social context and does not acknowledge the social context. Now, a lot of leftists do this in terms of political economy, that they will admit that we are community created beings, etc., but they don't do it in terms of their personal values. I one time took one of these value sorting tests, and it said that I was some African country because I was both highly collective and not very economically liberal. And it was funny because most of the leftists were like Sweden, which is highly personally liberal, but not liberal in the sense, not liberal in the like economic neoliberal sense. But I'm not that at all. And on a lot of these things, like back 10 years ago when Jonathan Haidt's temperament sorters were trying to explain to people with politics, I would often come off as kind of conservative-ish, because I valued interpersonal loyalty a lot, enough that I thought that interpersonal loyalty was even as important, if not more important, than ideological loyalty. Now, I could go into class formation about this too, how the sovereign individual really doesn't help middle class people because they compete amongst resources in a way that the poor can't and have to use interpersonal resources more readily because they just don't have material resources in the same way, so people matter more. But also, this is one of the things I think, for all the abuses and problems of traditional religion, whatever we mean by that, and I could go into my normal rant about how religion is very poorly defined. There's a real sense in which they understand that better than a lot of people who approach politics as an expression of their individual values that they came to on their own accord. To me, you don't understand where your politics are coming from if that's what your politics are doing. And they're probably neither really moral, because they're not rooted in a community where you can actually express this morality, nor are they really political, because they have no real relationship to power or the organization of other people in a way which actually changes anything. Anyway, back to this. People are going to be surprised how sympathetic I often am to Catholic social teachings. Not because I believe in their moral values around like abortion or gender or sexuality. I don't. But I do believe in their stuff about community. Not because the community has replaced the proletariat. There are class communities. Something to think about. But let us continue. It is. People often acted on beliefs that they did not necessarily know they had, and the human soul was a mass, generally highly disorganized mass of conflicting, highly obscure, and partially informed, inchoate, and unstable impulses and desires. As a side note, that was Geuss, but this is me. I don't necessarily believe in the soul, but I definitely believe in that. Most people's drives are beyond them and highly inchoate to themselves. This is why you need a community for that to matter. You have to practice as a group. Anyway, these are not in themselves all that easy to discern. And as if that were not enough, it is the case that virtually everyone under strong pressure to hide their impulses and desires from other words, anyone who has survived childhood would have internalized these pressures. Therefore, all humans had a deep impulse to hide, even from themselves, many desires which in any case were not all that easy to see. Perhaps one could, by various techniques, philosophic, religious, hygienic, pedagogical, or psychoanalytic, come to a slightly better understanding of oneself and one's desires and wants. But this would always be limited and incomplete and probably be highly perspectival. Even in the best case, such limited self-understanding would be rare and a special achievement, very difficult to acquire and maintain. It was then certainly a grave mistake to assume all adults were, by the virtue of being competent, rational adults, automatically psychologically self-transparent. It was even a mistake to think that most people were capable of becoming competent and self-transparent within a simple tutoring. Furthermore, as a matter of common everyday observation, that others sometimes knew what a given person wanted better than he or she did herself or himself. That needn't be a mystery about this. It was rather the proponents of the complete self-transparency of the human mind who were the mystery mongers. They were the ones who posited that every person, the existence of a dimension of the soul completely inaccessible to others, but also immediately and fully transparent to that person. Why assume the existence of any such thing? Actually, I'm going to go all Buddhist or Derek Parfit on you. Why assume the existence of any such consistent self at all? I don't. But I will continue. So, if the sovereignty of the individual required agents to know basically what they wanted, it was clearly a deeply flawed conception. Economic rationality and utilitarian rationality, this is me speaking, not Geuss, requires this, requires the self-transparency, and requires it to be calculable for others. Does not strike you as absurd if you actually know how humans actually interact? As my mom used to always tell me, your eyes point outward. To the extent which humans are not always, in fact, the best judges of what they actually want, and we have every reason to believe that this is to a significant extent true, and to that extent, too, at least they're not the best judges of what is in their own interest. I wish the reader to keep this point in mind because it remains, I think, valid and fairly incontrovertible. Although, as a side note, this is me speaking, not Geuss. Even on left world, it is assumed that you know what you want and you know your identity better than the people around you. I think this is a fundamentally flawed assertion. If someone tells me I'm a jerk, I'm probably a jerk. I wish the reader to keep this point in mind because I think it remains valid and fairly incontrovertible, even for those not willing to take the next step, which is more open to debate. The next step, namely, is to ask whether it is conceivable that the good might be something other or more than just what I want. For instance, actually or really want deep down. This need not be taken to mean what is good has nothing to do with what I happen to want. It may mean, for instance, that what is good is not cognitively accessible through mere introspection and analysis of what any one individual happens to want. Thus, there could be forms of the good which I can only come to see, even vaguely, if I were living as part of an appropriately constituted group of people held together, for instance, by faith and the sacraments. Geuss is talking about being Catholic here, so that makes sense. It is not just a collective discussion that was important, but collective action and experience. As a side note, I don't believe in the sacraments. I'm not a Christian. I have Christians on my show sometimes. I'm not here to chastise them either. But I do believe that what you do as a group is sacrosanct to your politics and your morality. In absence of a community, and remember, as a Marxist, I believe all communities are class, and in that class is conflict because of power relations in production. But in absence of community, you don't even have a self. You want to break someone down? Put them in isolation. See what happens. I do not even find this to be a controvertible thing to argue about. Let us continue. God, I sound like a priest when I say that. It is not just collective discussion that was important, but collective action and experience. This, Kriegler would say, was why one needed not only the isolated Protestant consciousness with his Bible and his God, but also a church. This was why I sometimes said that extra ecclesiam nola est solis. And I need to look up my Latin because I haven't studied Latin since I was a kid. Why did you study Latin as a kid? You were a poor kid. I have Catholics in my family. Dio Cassio. Nope. Wrong one. There is no salvation outside of the church, although the absence of the articles in Latin make it possible to read the following. Outside of the church, that is some church or another, there is no salvation. From within the situation, I might come to want this good, even though as an isolated individual, I would never, in principle, be able to see it, much less want it. And if there were anything remotely possible, starting from the position of the sovereign individual would be a mistake. To put this in a non-religious way, which Kliger did not actually do, but is obvious once one thinks about it, there might be inherently social goods invisible from the mere point of view of the individual. There is then no natural, immediate, simple, or easy path which leads humans from their epistemic position they happen to occupy to a position in which they have self-knowledge and know what is good for themselves or anyone else. Discovering what is good can certainly not be reliably expected from discussion alone, even from unlimited discussion under ideal circumstances, i.e. the deliberative discourse of Habermas or of liberals in general, or the marketplace of ideas. What a silly notion. Discovering what is good can certainly not be expected from discussion alone, even unlimited discussion under ideal circumstances. Discussion is not a universal panacea, given that people really are deeply different and can be expected to discover that more clearly the more they discuss serious issues. Contrary to the view sometimes advanced by followers of J.S. Mill, cough cough, which has been common on the left lately, discussion will not necessarily lead to greater understanding. Debate will not always save you. Sometimes you actually have to live. Hence my admiration, but also somewhat distant disdain of the young. Anyway, that was me talking that, guys. Contrary to what the view sometimes advanced by followers of J.S. Mill, discussion will not necessarily lead to greater understanding. It can sow division and increase animosity. Cough, cough. Social media, cough, 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 cough. And greater understanding need not lead to greater willingness to cooperate or to greater forgiveness. This will completely depend on the circumstances. Tot comprende na pas tot pardonor. There was a religious sense in which God would pardon all sins, but this was truth that had no direct analog in this world, where the question was rather or not, would I forgive you if you did something to harm or offend me, and under what conditions might I be willing to do that? As a side note, from my religious upbringing, I don't believe in universal forgiveness. I think it is a human folly. But often forgiveness is good for you from the selfish point of view, because holding a grudge and truly seeking revenge actually takes a lot out of a person. I know. I hold a grudge. But the world was a place in which forgiveness was a human virtue, not that was always forthcoming. Sometimes someone had to be transformed through real experience. Yes, they do. Your bro here definitely knows about that. As opposed to discussion, and only then could one make progress. Discussion with certain evil people might never be sufficient. They might need a much more radical form of re-education or therapy, neither of which would be completely free without any discursive elements, but both of which were forms of action that went beyond and could not simply be reduced to free discussion. This is the whole idea of the marketplace of ideas in liberalism. Furthermore, Krieger rejected the basic liberal tenet of neutrality, that there were certain limited and well-defined kinds of cases in which it was perfectly appropriate to find impartial judges. This is interesting because I actually don't think even most liberals believe this anymore, but that shift is actually new. A result largely of moving everything into the discourse. For instance, cases of minor disputes between neighbors who are in more regards are less equal in power, position, and standing. However, religious issues were not matters of minor importance, certainly not to believers. That is to say, they treat religious issues as not matters of transcendental importance, but basically as things at the same level as taste or simple choices, was not to make a neutral position on them. It was to say that one should not hold such a transcendental beliefs, and in any way not hold them as transcendental truths, and thus to exclude from appropriate consideration. Perhaps that was right, but it was certainly not a neutral assumption that could be unproblematically incorporated into the very framework of discussion, while still claiming impartiality of that framework. There are no neutral territories. That last part's me. Back to Geuss. To suspend their transcendental status would treat them as if they were simple matters of taste, opinion, or choice, which would be a kind of contradiction, because they say they had transcendental status was to say that they could not in this way be suspended. It was to reject them in a substantive way, while perhaps claiming incorrectly that one was merely engaging in a procedural form or neutral or value-free activity. Claims to neutrality were, in any case, often just excuses for making a choice, but being unwilling to accept that that was what one was doing and to hide it from scrutiny. Furthermore, no amount of fiddling with the conditions of neutral discussion and judgment would suffice to cancel out real differences in power. This was a post-Habsburg question which would never go away in the Eastern, Central, and Southern Europe. Why should we be a minority in your plural republic when your plural could be a minority in our republic? This question retains its pertinence if both republics are scrupulous in administering their law impartiality, and even if both had very well extensive sets of measures for special protections of minorities. And if you don't see how this is relevant to America, you're a fool. I'll continue on to the next section. Cromwell at the Seas of Ross. Kriegler and his colleagues knew nothing at all about British history or literature. They were fully aware of the deficiencies of their grasp of English. With so many native speakers of the language around in the immediate geographic vicinity of the school, it was then eminently sensible, in fact, virtually unavoidable, to hire one of them to teach English, even if he were not a member of that order. And so that's what was done. The choice fell on an Irish American man who was definitively put the accent on the first part of the compound and treated the course in English literature as a kind of mini introduction to Irish nationalism. Oh, Irish Catholics often do that. I have Ulster Irish Catholics in my family, so I know what that is like. Jews often do that too, and I have Jews in my family. He walked through the history of the early English literature, but rather in a perfunctory way, neither showing anything like enthusiasm for Shakespeare or Milton, or for instance, Laszlo Magyar, one of our Latin teachers, did for that subject. Magyar would stop in the middle of a class on Virgil, read some passages that was under consideration, and invite the class to admire it. Do you not see and hear Virgil's beauty? He would say. Nothing like that emanated from our English teacher for the 1,200 years of literature from Beowulf to the 19th century. Suddenly, however, at the end of the 19th century, he is transfigured because for him, and this was also for us, 20th century English literature was basically a study of Wilde, Yeats, Synge, and Joyce. Almost in infinite amounts, it seemed, of Joyce, whom we were encouraged to see as a master of all genres except drama. Joyce's poetry is bad, but anyway, that's just my personal opinion. Back to Geuss. And an unsurpassed exemplar of all literary virtues. One of the pre-20th century texts we all read with this teacher, though, was one from the 17th century, which fit into his anti-British, anti-Protestant Irish nationalist agenda. It was a message which Oliver Cromwell wrote to the governor of Ross in 1649 during Cromwell's military intervention in Ireland. Cromwell was besieging Ross and discussing with the governor the place of the terms of surrender, and he wrote, "As for that you mentioned concerning the liberty of conscience, I meddle not with any man's conscience. But if by liberty of conscience you mean liberty to exercise mass, I judge it best to use plain dealing, and to let you know, where the Parliament of England have power, that will not be allowed of." No one, of course, would take Oliver Cromwell to be the precursor of a precursor or a shining representative of the toleration or of liberalism in general, although in some ways the British Civil War, the English Civil War, is the origins of modern literature, because it produces modern liberal literature, not France, because it produces Hobbes, which is your first secular theory of statecraft, and thus everything goes from there. And political economy comes from Hobbes's friend, William Petty. Let us go back to the reading. And no one expects a philosophical treatise from the general of an army negotiating with the commander of opposing forces in time of war, except if that is Lenin or Mao for some reason. This is me talking. Well, I mean, Lenin wasn't a general. Trotsky was, and Mao was, but nonetheless. Still, we are told the structure of this reasoning was revealed a character hypocrisy. I meddle with no man's conscience, provided he was a Protestant conscience, and not one that enjoys his participation in the celebration of Mass. Structurally, this immediately brought to mind Kriegler had said in a more general way about liberalism, whose devotees affirmed that everything would be so much better if everyone's a liberal, and at least acted as if transcendental truths of religion were just matters of personal taste, but who also claimed to be adopting an impartial or even neutral stance. This gets us to the contradictions of liberalism around religion, but it's not the only place where you have to deal with it. Now, Geuss isn't just going to talk about this from the Catholic point of view. He's actually here to contrast, kind of like a Lester McIntyre in a different way, from the opposite direction, actually, the way the Catholic social teaching and Marxism relate in their general critique of liberality. One is kind of a rejection of it, the other emerges out of its weaknesses, but they agree on many things, and it's something to think about why that is the case. All right, my droogs. Like and subscribe if you're inclined. I would like to thank my new Kano Kahanan ML worldview. I suppose that tells us where my new supporters' philosophical stance is. I would like to thank you. Please leave a comment, like, review. You can argue with me. I might tell you off. If you insult me without giving me a reason, I will block you. I'm just going to state that outright. I don't block many people, though, because usually they have a reason for insulting me. Who knew? I might not engage with you, though. So anyway, those are the rules of the channel, but you can do pretty much what you want. I'm not the boss of you, but just remember that don't claim that you're neutral towards matters of conscience, or that you even can be. All right. Good day and good luck.